Musician vanished in 1996. 29 years later, fan finds hidden track with a name. The hiss was the sound of ghosts. Not the spooky clanking chains kind, but the ghosts of forgotten sound. Of moments trapped in rust-colored dust on a flimsy strip. Of plastic. Leo's apartment in 2025 was a museum of such ghosts. Stacks of vinyl records leaned against walls like tired old men. Their cardboard sleeves faded, smelling of damp basements and time. Cassette tapes, hundreds of them, were organized in cheap plastic racks. Their tiny spines a mosaic of faded ink and forgotten bands. This was his sanctuary, his obsession. And at the center of it all was Julian Skye. Julian Skye, the beautiful, doomed poet of 90s indie rock. The man with a voice like bruised velvet and lyrics that felt like they were torn directly from a secret diary. He had released 2 perfect, heartbreaking albums between 1994 and 1996, and then, nothing, he vanished. The official story, the one repeated in countless Where Are They Now? Articles and nostalgic documentaries, was that he'd simply walked away. Overwhelmed by the sudden crush of fame, he cashed out, cut his hair, and dissolved back into the civilian world, a modern-day Rambo who chose silence over the roar of the crowd. It was a romantic, tragic myth, and for most of his life, Leo had bought into it. It made Julian more than a musician. It made him a legend, an enigma. Tonight's ghost was a new one. A cassette he'd found buried in a crate at a flea market, in some forgotten corner of the San Fernando Valley. It wasn't an official release. The case was a standard clear plastic one, cracked at the hinge. The J-card was a simple piece of white paper, with 3 words scrawled in a messy, urgent black marker, JS Basement Demos. Leo's heart had hammered against his ribs when he saw it. Any unreleased Julian Skye material was a holy grail. He'd paid the grizzled vendor a crumpled $5 bill, his hand trembling slightly. Now, in the low, warm light of his apartment, the tape was in his Nakamichi deck, a machine he'd spent a month's salary to have restored. He was digitizing it, archiving it, as he did with all of them. The ritual was always the same. He'd pour a glass of whiskey, neat. He'd put on his Audio-Technica headphones, the big, plush ones that cupped his ears and blocked out the world, and he would listen. The first 3 songs were raw, acoustic versions of tracks from Julian's second album, Echoes in the Static. The sound quality was poor, full of tape hiss and the faint hum of an amplifier. But Julian's voice, God, his voice, it was right there, in Leo's ears, stripped of all the studio gloss. It was more vulnerable, more desperate. He sang of rain-slicked city streets, of lovers who were like ghosts in his bed, of a hollowness that fame could never fill. It was beautiful, heartbreaking. Leo closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, feeling the familiar, melancholic thrill of communion with his idol. He was hearing Julian as almost no one else ever had. This was the real man, not the myth. The 4th song was one Leo had never heard before. A haunting minor key ballad called Porcelain. The lyrics were darker than usual, speaking of something fragile being shattered beyond repair. Julian's voice cracked on the high notes, a raw, ragged edge of genuine pain. When the song faded out, Leo felt a profound sadness settle over him. This was it. The last gasp of a genius before he chose silence. He waited. The tape continued to spin. The counter on the deck ticked past the end of the song, Las 4:32. Las 4:33, he expected the click-clack of the autostop. But it didn't come. There was just hiss. The sound of empty, unrecorded tape. Leo sighed, reaching for the stop button. Probably just a long leader at the end of the reel. He was about to press it when a sound pricked his ears. A faint, almost imperceptible scrape. He froze, his finger hovering over the button. He turned the volume knob on his amplifier, cranking it up until the hiss was a roar. And then he heard it again, clearer this time. A sound like a wooden chair leg being dragged across a concrete floor. His breath caught in his throat. What was this then? A voice. It wasn't singing. It was a choked, guttural sound. A man clearing his throat, nervously. Just turn it off, man, please. Leo's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He knew its every tremble, its every nuance. It was Julian Skye, but it was a Julian he had never heard before. The voice was stripped of its melodic grace. It was thin, reedy, and vibrating with a terror so palpable it felt like a physical presence in the room. Another voice answered, this one smooth, calm, almost bored. It was a voice that held all the power. Turn it off. We're not done, Jules. We're just getting to the good part. Jules. Only his closest friends called him that. There's nothing else, Julian stammered. The sound was so intimate, so close. Leo felt like a voyeur, a trespasser, on a sacred, terrifying moment. The songs are done. I can't write any more today. It's not about the songs anymore, the second voice said. There was a faint rustling sound, like fabric. It's about the contract. It's about loyalty. You seem to have forgotten what that means. No, I haven't. Julian's voice was a desperate plea. Rick, I swear, I just need some time. The pressure, it's too much. Rick, the name hit Leo like a punch to the gut. Rick Vallaher, Julian's manager, the man who had discovered him, who had molded his image, who had stood by his side at awards shows, always smiling, the proud mentor. In all the stories, Rick was the one who had tried to talk Julian out of quitting, the one who was left heartbroken by his clients. Sudden departure, pressure. Rick's voice was a low sneer. You don't know what pressure is. Pressure is floating $250,000 to get an album made that your junky ass is too scared to even tour. Pressure is telling the label that their golden boy isn't a flight risk when I know, you've been looking for a way out since that first royalty check hit your bank account. There was a sudden, sharp sound, a thwack like an open palm hitting flesh. Julian cried out, a short, sharp gasp of pain. Oh my God, Leo whispered, his hands flying to his headphones, pressing them harder against his skull, as if he could, somehow, intervene. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. This wasn't a demo. This wasn't a skit. This was real. You hit me. Julian's voice was now just a whisper, full of disbelief and fear. You owe me, Julian. Rick's voice was colder now, harder. The false calm was gone, replaced by something reptilian. You don't get to just walk away. Not from me. You think you can just write a few sad songs, and I'll let you disappear with all that future earning potential. Our future. The one I built for you. It's my life. Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a surge of desperate defiance. No. It's not. Rick's reply was chillingly simple. It's my investment. There was another sound, a struggle, a frantic shuffling, a grunt of effort from Julian, then a heavier, more solid sound, as if a body had been shoved hard against a wall. Get your hands off me. Or what? Rick taunted. You'll write a song about it. You think anyone will believe you? The tortured artist, the sensitive soul. They love that story. They'll believe anything I tell them. They'll believe you are unstable, a drug addict, that you couldn't handle the fame. They'll believe you just vanished. It's a better story anyway, more romantic. Leo felt sick. He was shaking, a fine tremor running through his entire body. Every word Rick said was a chilling echo of the official narrative. The myth that had been sold to the world for 29 years. It wasn't a myth, it was a script, a cover story. And he was listening to it being written. He could hear Julian's breathing, harsh and ragged. He was crying now. Soft, broken sobs. Please, Rick, he begged. Please don't do this. Do? What? Rick's voice was soft again, a mockingly gentle purr that was more terrifying than his anger. I'm just protecting my interests. Securing my assets. You're the one who made this necessary, Jules. You should have just been grateful. You should have just done what you were told. There was a long, terrible silence. The only sound was the omnipresent tape hiss and Julian's quiet, terrified sobs. Leo held his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped his desk. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20, 30, dot. Then, a new sound. A heavy, metallic scrape. The sound of something being dragged. Something big dot, and then, the sound that would haunt Leo's nightmares for the rest of his life. A soft, rhythmic digging, schlick thump. The sound of a shovel. Slicing into soft earth, schlick thump. Over and over again. The sound was methodical, the sound of a man doing a job. Julian's sobs turned into a choked, panicked whimper. No. Oh God, no. Rick, what are you doing? What is that? Rick didn't answer. The only reply was the relentless, sickening rhythm of the shovel. Thump. Leo could picture it. A dark basement, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Julian, his beautiful, sensitive face streaked with tears and dirt, crumpled in a corner, and Rick Valor, his manager, his mentor, his friend, digging a hole in the dirt floor. No, Julian's voice rose to a full-blown scream, a sound of pure, primal terror that clawed at the inside of Leo's skull. Nitrogen monoxide, please, Rick. I'll do anything. I'll tour. I'll write, please. The digging stopped. Leo's entire body was coiled like a spring. Every nerve ending was screaming. Rick's voice came again, closer to the microphone now, as if he had leaned down. It was a whisper, a conspiratorial, venomous secret. It's too late for that, Jules. You're worth more to me as a legend. There was a final, desperate, muffled scream, a sound that was cut off abruptly. It was followed by a wet, heavy thud, and then silence again. A thick, profound silence that felt heavier, darker than before. After a few seconds, the digging resumed. Schlick thump. Thump. Faster now. More urgent. Schlick. Thump. Schlick. Thump. Schlick. Thump. The tape hissed for another minute, filled with nothing but that awful, rhythmic sound of a grave being filled. Then, a sharp, final click. And then, only the hiss of dead air. Leo didn't move. He couldn't. He sat frozen in his chair, the oversized headphones still clamped to his ears, sealing him in with the horror he had just heard. The whiskey in his glass sat untouched. The warm glow of the apartment felt like a violation. The world outside, the city humming with life, felt like a fiction. The only reality was the suffocating silence in his ears, the ghost of a sound that had just played out. A 35-year-old musician vanished in 1996. He hadn't vanished. He hadn't walked away. Leo felt a wave of nausea roll through him. He ripped the headphones from his head, stumbling back from his desk, his chair crashing into a stack of vinyl. The records slid to the floor with a clatter that sounded like an explosion in the dead quiet of the room. He stared at the Nakamichi deck, at the small, innocuous plastic cassette spinning silently inside it. A tomb, a tiny plastic tomb. He had just listened to the murder of Julian Skye, his hero, his idol. A man whose posters adorned his walls, whose voice had been the soundtrack to his entire life. He hadn't just been a fan. He'd been a devotee, an acolyte at the Church of St. Julian, and he had just become the sole witness, 29 years too late, to his idol's execution. The official story was a lie. A carefully constructed, monstrous lie. And Rick Valor, the smiling, grieving manager, had been the architect of it all. Leo's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic, screaming jumble. He thought of the documentaries, the interviews with Voller over the years. He could see his face, the faint sadness in his eyes, the carefully chosen words of a man mourning his lost friend and cash cow. Julian was a fragile soul, he'd say, shaking his head sadly. The world was just too loud for him. You're worth more to me as a legend. The words echoed in the silence of Leo's mind. A chilling, damning epitaph. Leo's gaze fell upon the J-card he had set on the desk. JS Basement Demos. He picked it up with a hand that shook so violently. He could barely read the writing. Who had labeled it? Julian himself, or someone else? Was this tape a mistake? An accident? Or was it left intentionally? A message in a bottle, tossed into the ocean of time, waiting for someone to find it. He stumbled to the bathroom and retched into the toilet, his body convulsing with a mixture of horror, disgust, and a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He was grieving not just for the man, but for the myth, for the beautiful, tragic story he had cherished. The truth was so much uglier, so much more brutal. When the heaving stopped, he splashed cold water on his face, staring at his own reflection in the mirror. He looked pale, haunted. His eyes were wide with a terror and a new, terrible knowledge. The world was different now. The past wasn't the past. It was a shallow grave, and he had just heard the shovel that dug it. He walked back into the living room, his legs unsteady. He ejected the cassette from the deck, holding it in his palm. It felt heavy, dangerous. A relic of a crime. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just sit on this. He couldn't be the only one who knew. The lie had lived for 29 years. It had to die. But how? Who would believe him? A reclusive music nerd with a 30-year-old bootleg tape. He could already hear the skepticism, the dismissals. The police would laugh him out of the station. He had no proof of where or when the recording was made. No chain of evidence. It was just a voice on a tape. He looked around his apartment, at his carefully curated collection of ghosts. For years, he had been a passive observer of the past. A collector. An archivist. But the hiss of that tape had changed everything. It had reached across 3 decades and dragged him into the story. He was no longer just a fan. He was the witness. And the dead man on that tape, the man with the bruised velvet voice, was screaming for justice. And Leo was the only one who could hear him. He had to do something. He just didn't know what. The weight of that knowledge, of that responsibility, was crushing. He slid down the wall, the cassette clutched in his hand like a holy, profane object, and for the first time in his adult life, Leo began to cry. He cried for the lost music, for the stolen life, and for the terrible, lonely silence that had just been broken. The man on the tape, Julian Skye, had been born Julian Sobieski, a name he shed as easily as a winter coat when he first picked up a guitar. He was a kid from the grey industrial suburbs of Cleveland, a place of smokestacks and perpetual overcast skies. His father, Stan, was a man forged in the crucible of the local auto plant, his hands permanently stained with grease, his silences as heavy and metallic as the steel he shaped all day. Stan saw the world in absolutes. Work was work. A man provided. And feelings were a luxury you couldn't afford, like fancy coffee or sleeping in on a Sunday. He looked at his son, a quiet, lanky boy with eyes the color of a stormy sea, and long, delicate fingers that seemed allergic to honest labor, and he saw a failure, a disappointment. Julian's mother, Alina, was the ghost in their small, cramped house. She had been a pianist once. A woman with a light in her eyes who spoke of Chopin and Liszt. But the light had dimmed over the years, extinguished by the grim reality of her life. She moved through the house like a whisper, her hands fluttering, nervously, her smiles rare and fleeting. She saw the same fragility in Julian that she recognized in herself, a sensitivity that this world, their world, would crush without a second thought. She encouraged his music in hushed tones, buying him his first cheap acoustic guitar from a pawnshop with money she'd skimmed from the grocery budget. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a secret pact between the two of them against the suffocating pragmatism of Stan. "You have a gift, Julian," she would whisper, her hand on his cheek, her eyes filled with a desperate, hopeful love. "Don't let him take it from you." He didn't. Music became his escape, his armor. He spent hours locked in his bedroom, the door blocked by a chair, his fingers bleeding on the steel strings. He wrote songs about the things he couldn't say, about the quiet desperation he saw in his mother's eyes, about the suffocating weight of his father's disapproval, about the yearning for a world bigger and brighter than the one he knew. His voice, at first, thin and uncertain, slowly deepened into that signature, bruised velvet tenor, a sound that held both the ache of his past and the dream of a future. He was 19 when he finally fled, packing a single duffel bag and his guitar, and buying a one-way bus ticket to Los Angeles. He left a note on his pillow, a simple two-line apology to his mother that he knew she would understand. He never saw either of them again. His father disowned him in a short, brutal phone call. His mother died of a quiet, creeping cancer, 2 years later, a fact he learned from a letter from a sympathetic aunt. The guilt of his absence became another ghost to haunt his songs. Another layer of beautiful, marketable sorrow. In LA, he was just another pretty face with a guitar sleeping on couches, playing to empty rooms in smoky bars. He was lost, lonely, and on the verge of giving up when Rick Valor found him. Rick was a predator who smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. He was a mid-level manager at a big label, a man in his late 30s with a slick, predatory charm and a Rolodex full of broken promises. He had a reputation for finding raw talent and grinding it into dust for a quick profit. He saw Julian playing at the Troubadour on an open mic night, a tiny, shivering flame in a sea of jaded industry. Sharks. He didn't just see talent, he saw a product. The shy, wounded boy from a broken home. The angelic face, the voice that bled emotion. It was perfect. It was a story he could sell. Rick descended on Julian like a savior. He bought him dinner. He bought him new clothes. He told him he was a star. He listened to Julian's stories of his cold father and his lost mother with a look of deep, practiced empathy. He became the father Julian never had, the mentor he craved. He took Julian's raw, sprawling songs and helped him shape them into tight 3-minute packages of pain. He got him a rehearsal space, a band, a record deal. He gave him the name Julian Sky, because Sobieski sounds like a sausage. Julian, young and starved for approval, drank it all in. He trusted Rick implicitly. He signed the contract without reading the fine print, a dense, convoluted document that essentially made him indentured servant to Rick Voller's production company. He saw Rick not as a manager, but as his partner, his friend, his savior. He didn't realize he was just a horse, and Rick was the one holding the betting slips. The first album, Rainy Day Requiem, was a modest success, an indie darling. It earned Julian a cult following and a critical buzz. But it was the second album, Echoes in the Static, that exploded. It went platinum. Suddenly, Julian Sky was everywhere. His face was on the cover of magazines. His voice was on every radio station. He was playing to sold-out theaters. The shy boy from Cleveland transformed into a bona fide rock star. But the transformation was a monstrous one. The fame he had dreamed of felt like a cage. The adoration of the crowds felt hollow. Every interview, every photo shoot, every demand for a new hit song felt like another piece of him being chipped away, another pound of flesh for the machine. He hated the fake smiles, the sycophants, the endless parties. He started drinking heavily, trying to numb the profound sense of dislocation, of being an imposter in his own life. He tried to talk to Rick about it, tried to explain that he needed to slow down, to breathe. But Rick would just smile, clap him on the back, and tell him to ride the wave. This is what we wanted, Jules. This is the dream. Julian began to see the cracks in his savior's facade. He saw the cold, calculating look in Rick's eyes when he talked about tour grosses and merchandise sales. He saw how Rick manipulated journalists, how he pitted band members against each other to maintain control. He started to feel less like an artist, and more like a piece of property. The more successful he became, the tighter Rick's grip became. The contract he'd signed so naively years ago was an iron cage. Rick owned his name, his songs, his image. Julian Sky was a brand, and Rick Voller was its CEO. Julian Sobieski, the boy from Cleveland, was being erased. The hidden witness, the third person in this tragic triangle, was a woman named Sarah Jenkins. In 1996, she was a 22-year-old audio engineer, fresh out of school and desperate for a job. She was sharp, ambitious, and one of the few women trying to make it in the boys' club of the LA music scene. She landed an internship at the legendary Sound City Studios, the same place where giants had recorded. Her job was mostly fetching coffee and wrapping mic cables, but she didn't care. She was there. She was breathing the same air that she was assigned to work as a tape operator on the Echoes in the Static sessions. She was in awe of Julian Sky. She loved his music, his vulnerability. In person, he was just as she imagined. Quiet, polite, painfully shy. He would give her a small, sad smile when she brought him tea. His stormy eyes making her feel like she was looking at something ancient and breakable. She developed a silent, secret crush on him, the kind of hopeless crush an intern has on a rock star. She also saw Rick Voller up close, and she didn't like what she saw. She saw the way he talked to Julian, a constant stream of subtle put-downs and passive-aggressive comments disguised as encouragement. He called him Jules in a way that sounded less like a nickname and more like a brand. He would dismiss Julian's artistic concerns with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry about that, Jules. That's what I'm here for. You just focus on being beautiful and sad." Sarah saw the flicker of pain in Julian's eyes every time. She was the one who operated the tape machine. She was the one who meticulously labeled the boxes. JS vocal take 3, JS guitar overdub. Her neat, precise handwriting was the polar opposite of the chaotic scrawl on the demo tape Leo would find decades later. She was a silent observer in the control room, watching the dynamic play out through the thick studio glass. She saw Julian growing more and more withdrawn. His shoulders perpetually slumped, the light in his eyes dimming with each passing week. She saw Rick growing more and more controlling, his bonhomie replaced by a sharp, impatient edge. One night, late in the session, Julian was struggling with a vocal take. His voice was raw, and he couldn't hit a high note. Rick, who had been drinking, lost his temper. He got on the talkback mic, his voice booming into the vocal booth. "What the hell is wrong with you? It's 3 notes. Just sing the damn notes. The label is breathing down my neck." Julian just stood there, his head bowed. Sarah saw a single tear trace a path down his cheek. He took off his headphones, opened the door to the booth, and walked out of the studio without a word. Rick slammed his fist on the multi-million-dollar mixing console. "Damn it," he roared, his face purple with rage. He turned and saw Sarah staring at him, her expression a mixture of fear and disgust. His eyes narrowed. "What are you looking at?" he snarled. "Nothing," she mumbled, quickly looking down at the tape machine. "You're the intern, right?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're lucky to be in this room. Remember that you see nothing, you hear nothing, you just press record when you're told." Got it, she whispered, her heart pounding. That was the moment her crush on Julian solidified into a deep, protective empathy, and her dislike of Rick Voller curdled into genuine fear. She knew something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. But she was a 22-year-old intern. What could she do? Who would she tell? She had student loans to pay, a career she was desperate to build. So she did what she was told. She kept her head down, she saw nothing, she heard nothing, and the guilt of that silence would become its own kind of ghost, one that would follow her for the next 29 years. She was the one who saw the foundation of the grave being dug, long before the first shovel of dirt was ever moved. The success of Echoes in the Static was a tidal wave that swept Julian further and further from shore. The pressure didn't just escalate, it became a physical entity, a monster that lived in his hotel rooms and stalked him on stage. Rick Voller, emboldened by the platinum plaques and soaring profits, became more than a manager. He was a warden. Every aspect of Julian's life was now under his control. Rick dictated what he wore, what he said in interviews, even who he was seen with. He manufactured a brief high-profile romance between Julian and a pop starlet. A cynical PR move that left Julian feeling hollowed out and used. "It's good for your image, Jules," Rick would say, clapping him on the back while his eyes scanned the gossip columns. "A little bit of romance to soften the edges. Makes you more relatable to the girls who buy the records." "I don't even like her," Julian mumbled one night, staring at his own reflection in the window of a limousine. He looked pale and thin, a ghost in a designer suit. "You don't have to like her," Rick replied, not even looking up from his phone. "You just have to be photographed with her. Smile, look tragic, it's your brand." The betrayal was a constant, low-grade poison. His bandmates, once friends, were now on Rick's payroll. They watched with a mixture of pity and resentment as Julian unraveled. They were paid to be there, to play the songs, to keep the machine running. They kept their distance. To get too close to Julian was to risk the wrath of Rick, and Rick was the man who signed their checks. One night, after a show in Chicago, the band's drummer, a grizzled veteran named Mac, found Julian in the dressing room, staring at a bottle of whiskey, his hands shaking. "You gotta be careful with that stuff, kid," Mac said gently. Julian looked up, his eyes wide and lost. "He's going to kill me, Mac," he whispered. "This thing, it's going to kill me." "Don't talk like that," Mac said, shifting uncomfortably. "You see it," Julian pressed, his voice desperate. "You see what he's doing. Why won't any of you help me?" Mac looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not our place, Julian, it's between you and Rick. Just try to get some sleep." He turned and left, closing the door on Julian's quiet desperation. The click of the latch was another nail in the coffin. The humiliation was a public spectacle. Rick seemed to delight in it. During a soundcheck for a major television appearance, Julian's voice, shredded from the relentless touring schedule, kept cracking. Rick, in front of the entire crew, snatched the microphone from his hand. "Can someone get the artist some tea and honey?" he announced, his voice dripping with sarcastic contempt. "Our golden goose seems to be losing his voice. Or maybe just his nerve." The crew averted their eyes, a collective cringe of secondhand shame. Julian just stood there, his face burning, his fists clenched at his sides. He felt like a child being scolded in front of his entire class. He began to fight back in the only way he knew how. Self-destruction. He would show up to interviews drunk. He would deliberately flub lyrics on stage. He wrote new songs, dark, discordant things that were commercially toxic. They weren't about heartbreak and rain anymore. They were about control, manipulation, and rage. They were songs about Rick. He played one for Rick in a hotel room in New York. It was a snarling, atonal song called The Puppeteer. The lyrics were barely veiled. "You pull my strings and call it art. You sell my pain and call it smart. But the doll is cracking, can't you see? One of these days, it's gonna break free." When he finished, the room was silent. Rick just sat there, staring at him, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. "That's cute, Jules," he said softly, "really cute. A little rebellion, it's a good look, but you and I both know who owns the doll, the strings, and the whole damn puppet show. That song will never see the light of day. And if you ever play it again, for anyone, I will personally sue you into oblivion with the money you earned for me. Do you understand?" The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Julian understood perfectly. He was trapped. The cage wasn't just metaphorical anymore. It was legal, financial, and psychological. Every move he made was blocked. He talked to a lawyer once, secretly. The lawyer looked over the contract he'd signed and just shook his head. "This is ironclad, son. He owns you. The only way out of this is to declare bankruptcy and ruin your career, or to fulfill the terms. 5 albums and their subsequent world tours. 5 more albums." It felt like a life sentence. Meanwhile, Sarah Jenkins, the intern, had finished her stint at Sound City. But Rick Valor remembered her. He remembered the look in her eyes. He offered her a job. Not as an engineer, but as his personal assistant. The pay was good, too good to refuse. She told herself it was a foot in the door, a way to stay in the industry. But she knew, deep down, why he had hired her. He was keeping her close. The one person who had seen him lose his composure. The one person who had looked at him with something other than fear or admiration. He wanted her under his thumb. Her job was to manage Rick's schedule. But it quickly became clear that her real job was to be another pair of eyes on Julian. She was the one who had to call his hotel room a dozen times to make sure he was awake. She was the one who had to search his luggage for contraband alcohol. She was the one who had to sit outside dressing rooms, listening, always listening. She became a reluctant jailer, and the guilt was eating her alive. She tried, in small ways, to be a friend to Julian. She would bring him books she thought he might like, biographies of poets who had survived their own darkness. She would talk to him about anything other than music, about movies or the weather, just to see a flicker of the real person behind the haunted rock star persona. He was grateful. She could tell. He would give her those small, sad smiles, and for a few minutes, he would seem almost normal. One afternoon, in a recording studio in London, Rick was out at a lunch meeting. Julian was supposed to be working on a guitar part, but he just sat in the control room, staring into space. Sarah was cataloging tapes. "He's never going to let me go, is he?" Julian said suddenly, his voice quiet. Sarah froze. She looked at the door, terrified Rick would walk in. "Yes, you do," he said, turning to look at her, his stormy eyes locking onto hers. "You see it? You see everything. You're the only one who does." She couldn't speak. Her throat was tight with fear and pity. "I have some money saved," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Money he doesn't know about. From before. I have a plan. To just disappear. Change my name. Go somewhere no one knows me." Sarah's heart pounded. This was dangerous. She shouldn't be hearing this. "Julian, you can't. I have to," he insisted, his eyes pleading with her. "But I need help. I need a witness. Someone who knows what he did, what he's like, in case he comes after me." He took a deep breath. "I'm recording things. Conversations, like this one. I have a little micro-cassette recorder. I keep it in my pocket." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "That's insane. He'll kill you if he finds that." "He's killing me now," Julian said, his voice flat. Just slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny, cheap cassette. He pressed it into her hand, her fingers closed around the warm plastic. It felt like a bomb. "This is a copy," he whispered, "of a fight we had. It's bad. I want you to have it, just in case. Please, Sarah, you're the only one I trust." She stared at the tape in her palm. Her mind was screaming at her to refuse, to run, to pretend this conversation never happened. But she looked at Julian's face, at the raw desperation in his eyes, the face of a man standing on a ledge. She couldn't say no. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Okay, Julian." She slipped the tape into her pocket, just as she heard the sound of the studio door opening. Rick Valor walked in, smiling his predatory smile. "Making progress, boys and girls?" he asked, his eyes flicking between Sarah and Julian, a silent, knowing accusation in his gaze. Sarah felt the tape in her pocket, a cold, hard square of terror against her leg. She had just crossed a line. She was no longer just a witness. She was an accomplice, and she was terrified of what would happen when Rick found out. The basement was Rick's secret weapon. It wasn't a part of any official recording studio. It was a damp, unfinished space beneath a nondescript warehouse he owned in Van Nuys, a place he used to store old equipment and tour merchandise. It was soundproofed, isolated, and completely off the books. It was the perfect place for a conversation no one was ever meant to hear. The final brutal escalation began when Julian served Rick with a formal letter from a new lawyer, announcing his intention to sue to dissolve their contract on the grounds of undue influence and professional misconduct. It was a declaration of war. Rick didn't explode. He didn't yell. He received the letter via messenger, read it in his pristine office overlooking the city, and a terrifying calm settled over him. He folded the letter, placed it neatly on his desk, and told Sarah to clear his schedule for the rest of the day. Then he made one phone call. "Jules," he said, his voice as smooth and placid as a frozen lake, "we need to talk. Not with lawyers, just you and me. I've got some old gear in my warehouse, some vintage amps I think you'll love. Let's go. Check them out, clear the air for old time's sake." It was a trap, and they both knew it. But Julian, exhausted from the fight, naively believing that a final honest confrontation could somehow lead to a peaceful resolution, agreed. Perhaps he thought he could reason with the man he once saw as a father figure. Perhaps he was just tired of running. Sarah knew. When Rick told her where he was going, a cold dread washed over her. "Don't you think you should have the lawyers handle it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Rick turned to her, his eyes like chips of ice. "My dear Sarah," he said, the condescension thicker than ever. "You are an excellent assistant, but you are not my advisor. I suggest you remember that. Go home. I'll call you if I need you." She watched him walk out, his movements calm and deliberate. She thought of the microcassette Julian had given her, hidden away in a shoebox in her closet. She thought of his desperate, whispered plan to disappear. She had a choice to make. She could obey Rick, go home, and pretend she knew nothing, or she could do something. Her conscience and her fear waged a silent, frantic war within her. Fear won. She stayed at her desk, her hands clenched into fists, and waited down in the Van Nuys basement, under the humming fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and dust. The vintage amps were just a pretense. The room was mostly empty, except for a couple of wooden chairs and a single beat-up tape recorder sitting on a crate. Not a multi-track studio machine, but a simple cassette deck. The same kind of deck Leo would use decades later. "What is this?" Julian asked, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete space. He saw the tape deck and his heart began to pound. "This," Rick said, gesturing around the room, "is a reality check." He walked over to the deck and pressed the play and record buttons simultaneously. The reels began to turn. "I thought we should document our little chat." For posterity, his smile was gone. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "A lawsuit, Julian. A lawsuit. After everything I've done for you, I plucked you from obscurity. I gave you a life you couldn't have dreamed of, and this is how you repay me." "You trapped me," Julian said, his voice shaking but firm. "You took my music, you took my life, and you turned it into a product. I want it back." Rick laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You have nothing. I own you. Your name, your face. The sad little songs you scribble in your notebook. They're all mine. The court will see that. They will bury you in legal fees. You will never work in this town, or any other, ever again." "Then I'll disappear," Julian shot back, a flash of his old defiance. "You can't stop me from just walking away, can't I?" Rick's voice dropped to a whisper. He took a step closer, invading Julian's space. "You see, that's where you're wrong. You leaving is a loose end. And I don't like loose ends. A messy lawsuit, a tell-all interview. It damages the brand. It tarnishes the legacy." He paused, letting the words hang in the dead air. "But a mystery, a tragedy, a beautiful, sensitive artist who just vanishes at the height of his fame. That's a story that sells forever. Re-releases, box sets, documentaries. The myth is always more profitable than the man." The full, horrifying reality of the situation finally dawned on Julian. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't an argument. This was a verdict. He looked at Rick's eyes and saw nothing, a complete and utter void of empathy. He saw the shovel. He heard the sound of the dirt. He was standing in his own grave. This was the moment captured on the tape. The pleading, the struggle, the terrifying, methodical sound of the shovel. Rick hadn't just planned to intimidate him. He had planned to erase him. The demo tape wasn't an accident. It was the point. He wanted a record. Not of the murder itself, perhaps, but of Julian's terror, of his final, broken moments. A trophy, a private memento of his ultimate victory. But Rick made a mistake. In his arrogance, he used a cheap, reusable cassette. And after he had finished his gruesome task, the basement floor was level once more, and Julian's sky was nothing more than a ghost in the machine. He had taken the tape. He likely intended to record over it, to erase the evidence of his crime. But in the chaos and adrenaline of the aftermath, he must have forgotten. He must have tossed it into a box with other old demos, other forgotten projects. A box that, through some twist of fate, ended up in a warehouse, then a storage unit. And finally, decades later, in a cardboard box at a flea market, waiting for an obsessive fan to find it. The hidden clue was the tape itself. But there was another dot back in her apartment that night. Sarah Jenkins couldn't sleep. The silence from Rick was more terrifying than any phone call. Every hour that passed was another turn of the screw. Finally, at 3 a.m., her phone rang. It was Rick. His voice was calm, but there was a strange, breathless quality to it. "Sarah, sorry to call so late. There's been a change of plans." "What happened?" she asked, her heart hammering. "Is Julian okay?" There was a pause. "Julian's gone," Rick said, his voice now laced with a practiced, theatrical sadness. "He just walked out. Said he was done. Took his passport and left. I tried to stop him, but you know how he is, a fragile soul." It was the story, the official story, the lie, and he was delivering it to her, his first test audience. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She knew he was lying. She thought of the tape in her closet, of Julian's whispered fears. "Gone where?" she managed to ask. "Who knows? He just vanished." "Listen, I'm going to need you to come in early tomorrow. We have to get ahead of this. Call the label, the publicist. We need to control the narrative." He hung up. Sarah sat in the dark, the phone still pressed to her ear. She knew. She didn't know the details, but she knew in her bones that Julian wasn't just gone, he was gone forever. And Rick was the reason why. The fear she felt was immense, paralyzing. He would kill her, too, if he ever found out what she knew, what she possessed. She had to run. She packed a bag in a frantic daze. She took the shoebox with the micro-cassette. It was her only proof, her only shield, as flimsy as it was. She drove east, away from Los Angeles, away from the music industry, away from Rick. Valar. She changed her name, cut her hair, and for the next 29 years she lived in a self-imposed witness protection program. A ghost haunted by a silence she had been forced to keep. The full conspiracy wasn't just a murder, it was the complete and total erasure of a human being, and the construction of a myth to hide the crime. And the only two pieces of proof, the two tapes recorded on opposite sides of the same horrible night, were now scattered, waiting for the right person to put the story together. For 29 years, the silence held. Rick Voller's myth was a masterpiece of macabre public relations. Julian Skye became a legend, his tragedy, a romantic footnote in music history. Voller grew richer and more powerful, becoming a titan of the industry, his reputation built on the carefully managed legacy of the man he had murdered. He was untouchable, a king ruling an empire built on a grave. Sarah Jenkins, now living as Susan Rayner, a quiet librarian in a small Colorado town, lived in constant low-grade fear, the microcassette, a toxic secret, locked away in a safe deposit box. The silence broke on a Tuesday in October 2025. It broke with a single email. Leo, after a week of sleepless nights and paranoid obsessive listening sessions, knew he couldn't go to the police. They would never believe him. He needed more. He needed to break the story in a way the world couldn't ignore. There was only one person he could think of. One person with the credibility and the courage to take on a monster like Rick Voller. Her name was Darcy Wells, the host of the wildly popular investigative podcast, Unsolved. Darcy was a journalistic pitbull, a woman who had built her career on giving voice to the voiceless and exposing the crimes of the powerful. Her podcast had brought down corrupt politicians, freed wrongfully convicted prisoners, and become a cultural phenomenon. If anyone could unravel this, it was her. Leo spent hours composing the email. He knew he sounded like a lunatic, a conspiracy theorist, but he poured all the horror, all the conviction, all the certainty he felt into the words. He attached a single, heavily encrypted audio file, the last 2 minutes of the tape. The muffled scream, the thud, and the relentless, sickening sound of the shovel. He titled the email, "The Vanishing of Julian Skye. I Know What Happened." He hit send, his heart pounding, and waited. For 3 days. There was nothing. Leo fell into a spiral of despair, convinced he'd been dismissed as just another crank. He was sitting in his darkened apartment, the cassette tape on the table, in front of him like a malevolent idol, when his phone buzzed. An unknown number. "Is this Leo?" The voice was crisp, no nonsense, and instantly recognizable. It was Darcy Wells. Yes, Leo breathed, his throat suddenly dry. I got your email, she said. I've listened to the file. About 100 times. I need you to tell me everything. And I mean everything. Don't leave out a single detail. For the next 2 hours, Leo poured out the story. The flea market, the Nakamichi deck, the shock of hearing those voices. He told her about his obsession with Julian, his encyclopedic knowledge of his life and career. Darcy listened patiently, interrupting only to ask sharp, probing questions. How do you know it's his voice? How do you know it's Vola? What else was on the tape? When he was finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Okay, Darcy said finally, her voice tight with a controlled excitement that sent a thrill of hope through Leo. This is either the biggest hoax in music history, or the biggest story of my career. I'm booking a flight to LA, don't talk to anyone. Don't play that tape for anyone else. I'll be there tomorrow. The payoff wasn't a single moment. It was a carefully orchestrated demolition. Darcy Wells was a master strategist. She knew that a 30-year-old audio tape, however horrifying, wasn't enough on its own. Vola's lawyers would tear it apart, claim it was a forgery, a prank, a piece of performance art. She needed more. She needed to corroborate the uncorroborated. Her team of researchers, a group of brilliant, relentless digital sleuths, went to work. They dug into Rick Vola's life, his finances, his business dealings. They found the shell corporation that owned the warehouse in Van Nuys. They pulled the property records, the building permits. They discovered that in late 1996, shortly after Julian's disappearance, there had been a permit filed for foundation repair on the warehouse basement. The contractor was a company that had gone out of business a year later, its owner having died of a sudden heart attack. It was a dead end, but a suspicious one. While her team dug into the past, Darcy focused on the present. She needed to rattle the cage. She launched a new season of Unsolved, teasing a special investigation into a legendary cold case from the music industry. She didn't name names, but the hints were just specific enough to set the internet on fire with speculation. The forums and fan groups that Leo lived on exploded. Was it about Kurt Cobain, Tupac? The clues all pointed to Julian Sky. The buzz reached Rick Vola. He issued a statement through his publicist, dismissing the podcast as a desperate, ghoulish attempt to profit from a personal tragedy, and reiterated the official story of Julian's fragile state and voluntary exile. But it was too late. The narrative was no longer under his control. The key, Darcy knew, was Sarah Jenkins. If the woman on Julian's tape was real, if she had another piece of the puzzle, she had to be found. Darcy's team started with the Sound City employment records from 1996. They found Sarah's name, and then they hit a brick wall. Sarah Jenkins had vanished as completely as Julian Sky. No credit history, no sociomedia, no public records after 1996. It was as if she had ceased to exist. Darcy put a call out on her podcast. It was a shot in the dark, a plea cast into the digital void. We are looking for a woman named Sarah Jenkins, she said, her voice steady and clear. She worked as a studio intern in Los Angeles in the mid-90s. She may have information vital to a case of a missing person. If you are Sarah, or if you know where she is, please contact us. You can be assured of complete anonymity and protection. In a quiet library in Colorado, a woman named Susan Rayner heard that broadcast. She was shelving books, the quiet rustle of paper the only sound in the peaceful room. When she heard her real name, a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 20 years, she dropped a stack of books. Her blood ran cold. They had found her. He had found her. Her first instinct was to run again, to pack her bag and disappear once more. But then she heard Darcy's voice, calm and reassuring. She thought of Julian, of his desperate, pleading eyes as he pressed that tape into her hand. She thought of the 29 years she had lived in fear, the 29 years a murderer had walked free, celebrated as a visionary. The guilt, the fear, the silence. It was a cancer that had been eating her alive for 3 decades. Maybe it was time to cut it out. With trembling hands, she went into her office, closed the door, and made the phone call she had been dreading for half her life. The final act was pure cinematic theater. Darcy arranged a meeting, a final interview. With Rick Voller, his ego, his belief in his own untouchability, was his undoing. He agreed, seeing it as a chance to publicly crush Darcy and her vulture journalism once and for all. He wanted to do it live. A live-streamed event, hosted by a neutral, respected journalist, where he could finally put the disgusting rumors to rest. It was a trap, and he walked right into it. The studio was brightly lit. The cameras were rolling, the live stream was active with millions of viewers. Rick Voller sat opposite Darcy Wells, looking smooth, confident, and statesmanlike in a tailored suit. He began by delivering his well-rehearsed eulogy for Julian, his voice full of sorrow and affection. He was masterful. Darcy let him talk. She let him build his own gallows. Then, she leaned forward. "Mr. Voller," she said, her voice cutting through his performance. "I have one final piece of evidence I'd like to present. A recording." Voller's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the corners. "Another one. I've heard the recording you've been circulating. It's an obvious fabrication, a pathetic attempt to knot that recording," Darcy interrupted. "A different one, from a different source." She looked off camera. "Please, come in." The studio door opened. A woman with graying hair and quiet haunted eyes walked onto the set. She looked terrified, but resolute. It was Sarah Jenkins Voller's face went white. For the first time in 29 years, the mask slipped. He looked at her, his mouth slightly agape, and for a fleeting second, the world saw not the powerful industry mogul, but the panicked, cornered killer. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Speaking into the microphone Darcy offered her. "And in 1996, Julian Skye gave me this." She held up a tiny mic cassette. "He told me he was afraid of this man. He told me he was recording their conversations, in case something happened to him. This is an ambush." Voller sputtered, half rising from his chair. "She's a disgruntled former employee. A liar." "Then you won't mind if we play it, will you?" Darcy said, her voice like steel. She nodded to the control room, and they played it. The audio was tinny, full of static. But the voices were clear. It was a recording of the argument in the New York hotel room. The argument about the puppeteer. "That song will never see the light of day. And if you ever play it again, for anyone, I will personally sue you into oblivion with the money you earned for me. Do you understand?" The world heard the threat. The cold, venomous promise. It was the motive, the proof of the coercion, the missing link. It was the voice of a man not trying to help a troubled artist, but of a man threatening. His prisoner Voller stared, speechless, his face a mask of horror. He was undone. But Darcy wasn't finished. This was the cinematic payoff. She looked directly into the main camera, speaking now not just to Voller, but to the millions watching. The voice on this tape, threatening to ruin Julian Skye, is the same voice that, just weeks later, would be recorded in a basement in Van Nuys, standing over Julian's body. The same voice that said. She paused, letting the silence stretch for maximum impact. Then, she played the final damning clip from Leo's tape. "It's too late for that. Jules, you're worth more to me as a legend." The words echoed in the stunned silence of the studio. It was a confession, a public execution of a lie. That exact moment, as if on cue, two LAPD detectives, who had been waiting off stage with a warrant based on the combined evidence, walked onto the set. They walked past the cameras, past the stunned host, and stopped behind Rick Voller's chair. "Richard Voller," one of them said, his voice flat and official. "You are under arrest for the murder of Julian Sobeski." The chaos was instantaneous. Voller screamed, a raw animal sound of pure rage and disbelief. He lunged, not at the cops, but at Darcy, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. The detectives tackled him, wrestling him to the ground, as cameras flashed and the live stream broadcast the humiliating, pathetic end of a king to the entire world. It was brutal, It was shocking. It was public. And for Leo, watching on a monitor in the green room, and for Sarah, standing there as a ghost from the past finally finding her voice, it was the most beautiful, cathartic justice imaginable. The silence had been broken, and the sound it made was an explosion. The aftermath was a storm. The arrest of Rick Valor wasn't just a news story, it was a cultural reckoning. The myth of Julian Skye, the tortured romantic who chose silence, was shattered, replaced by the brutal, sordid truth of his murder. The story dominated every news cycle, every social media feed. Voller's empire crumbled overnight. Artists he managed fled, his label went into receivership, and his name became synonymous with a monstrous, sociopathic evil. The trial was a formality. Faced with two separate corroborating tapes, and Sarah's unshakable testimony, defense collapsed. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remained defiant to the end, a snarling, unrepentant monster. A stark contrast to the charming, empathetic mentor he had pretended to be for 3 decades. For Leo, the world had been turned upside down. He was no longer an anonymous fan hiding in a cluttered apartment. He was the fan who found the truth. He was hounded by reporters, offered book deals, hailed as a hero. But he felt none of the triumph. He felt hollowed out, exhausted. He had wanted justice for Julian, and he had gotten it. But it didn't bring Julian back. It didn't undig the grave. The joy of the victory was tainted by the profound sorrow of the crime. He retreated from the spotlight, refusing the interviews and the offers. His only public statement was a short post on his old fan forum. He deserved to be heard. Now he is. Rest in peace, Julian. Sarah Jenkins, her testimony given, her long-held secret finally released, did not return to being Susan Rayner. She couldn't. She had lived as a ghost for too long. With a portion of the reward money offered by the Skye estate, she started a foundation in Julian's real name, the Julian Sobieski Foundation for Young Musicians, an organization dedicated to providing legal and mental health support for artists navigating the treacherous waters of the music industry. It was her penance and her purpose, a way to ensure that no other young, fragile talent would ever fall into the hands of a predator like Rick Voller. She had found her voice, and she would now use it to protect others. The police, armed with the location of the warehouse and the old building permits, brought in a forensics team. They used ground-penetrating radar on the basement floor. They found the anomaly, the area of disturbed earth, exactly where the schematics said it should be. They broke through the concrete, and they're buried in the damp California soil for 29 years. They found him. Julian Sobieski was finally brought out into the sun. There was no family to claim the body. No one left from that gray, industrial town in Ohio. The funeral was a quiet, private affair, arranged by the estate, and attended only by a handful of people. The lawyers, a few of his old guilt-ridden bandmates, Sarah Jenkins, and Leo. Leo stood at the back, feeling like an intruder. He watched as a simple wooden casket was lowered into the ground in a peaceful, green corner of the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. There was no grand spectacle, no rock and roll circus. It was just a quiet, sad farewell to a man the world had never really known. After the service, Sarah walked over to him. She looked older, tired, but the haunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. "He would have been grateful to you," she said, her voice soft. "I just listened to a tape," Leo said, shaking his head. "You're the one who was brave." "We both were," she corrected him gently. In our own time. She paused, looking at the fresh grave, at the simple headstone that had been prepared. It didn't say Julian Skye. It said, Julian Sobieski, 1961 to 1996, the rest is silence. It's a line from Hamlet. Sarah explained. He loved Shakespeare. He said it was the ultimate story of a sensitive soul being crushed by a corrupt world. Leo nodded, a lump forming in his throat. It was perfect. They stood there for a while longer, two strangers bound by a dead man's ghost. The air was warm, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was a beautiful day for a funeral. Leo never went back to his apartment full of ghosts. He couldn't. The thrill of collecting was gone, replaced by the weight of the reality behind the artifacts. He sold the collection, all of it. The vinyl, the posters, the precious Nakamichi tape deck. He used the money to go back to school, to study forensic audio analysis. He had found a new calling, a new way to listen to the ghosts, not as a fan, but as an advocate for the truth. The story ended, but the emotional echo lingered. It was a story about murder, but it was also about art, and ownership, and the stories we tell ourselves. It was a reminder that behind every legend, there is a human being, and behind every silence, there is a voice waiting to be heard. Years later, on the anniversary of the day he found the tape, Leo visited the grave. He laid a single white rose on the grass. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful. The city hummed in the distance, a world that had moved on, that had already half forgotten the scandal. But Leo remembered. He would always remember the hiss of the tape, the sound of the shovel, the voice that had reached out across 3 decades and demanded justice. He looked at the name on the stone. Julian Sobieski, not a myth, not a brand, a man. A man whose final terrible moments had become the beginning of Leo's real life. The cost of the truth had been immense, but the cost of silence, he now knew, was so much greater. He turned and walked away, leaving the grave in the warm California sun, finally at peace. The silence, no longer a source of terror, but a canvas for a new, quieter, and more honest life. The ghost was at rest, and in a way, so was he.